Have you ever found yourself at the intersection of superficial and deep? At the intersection of face value, yup, that's what it seems to say, and yet that nagging feeling that there's got to be more to this than that. If so, then you have also been at the intersection of this rather friendly conflict.
Hey, really, what is that?
Well, Jesus died on the cross. It's a T.
Jesus died on the cross. It's a T. Yeah, it's just a T. Today's parable, today's story of Jesus brings us to that very same intersection. Because the presumed straightforward meaning of this text is, as you read it, would seem to indicate that somebody was commended for doing something that was crooked or just didn't have the highest values. And so on the one hand, it's got that, but then there's this, wait a minute. Is that to say that Jesus is endorsing a shyster's methods to accomplish kingdom purposes? Is that really what's going on here? So the story is one about the unjust steward. So another name for this, depending on the translation that you have, is the dishonest manager, or my favorite, which is the shrewd manager. And almost universally, every scholar says that this is one of the most objectionable, this is one of the most problematic stories that Jesus told. Because in this story, it would appear that someone the manager, is being commended for unethical behavior. Unethical behavior to get the outcome that is desired, and again, is that for the kingdom outcome. And so this just raises all kinds of red flags. Now, the stories of Jesus, parables, if you're familiar with storytelling, we all probably know that story that just makes you cry, right? Doesn't matter how many times you hear it, it just sort of evokes the tears and it wells up the emotions. And then all of us probably also know stories that are so riveting, that are so memorable, that if you tell that story in the presence of someone else who also knows that story, if you don't tell it correctly, what do? They correct you. Exactly right. They make you get it right. But then there are also those stories that are troubling. These are disturbing stories. These are stories that kind of gnaw in you and that you can't let go of, that you think about long after the story's been told. Now, Norman Perrin, who was a great scholar of the scriptures at Southern Methodist University a number of years ago before he passed away, and he was also an expert on the parables, referred to this as being tensive symbols. And what he meant by tensive symbols is there was a purposefulness that Jesus told the stories because there was meaning, there was a point, if you will. That might not be the right way of saying it, but also he told them because these stories took on a life of their own inside of you, and that the Holy Spirit would work in your heart and mind, maybe troubling you, disturbing you, to go in a different direction or for you to get meaning that you otherwise wouldn't have gotten in your natural self. It was the work of the Holy Spirit. They would linger in your mind. They were tensive symbols. It's almost, and they were meant to be disturbing, it's almost like poking the bear. You know, it's almost like agitating for a purpose, provoking for a purpose. Now, this man's name is Tony Campolo. He too has passed away, but he was a very beloved Baptist preacher, and he had a fiery nature to the way that he preached, and just very, very engaging. But he had a tremendous passion for seeing followers of Jesus make a difference in the world as it is, and all of the dilemmas and problems that we face or the injustices that are there. So one time he was in the pulpit and he was preaching, and he was just thundering out the message, and he said, "Do you realize that 8,000 to 20,000 people die every day from hunger?" And then he paused and he looked at them very intensely and he says, "And you don't give a," and he used an expletive to make the point. And then there was just deafening silence. And he said, what's even more problematic is that you care more that I swore in church than that those people are dying. Now, it was a little bit over the top. It was a little bit more unrefined than Jesus might have done, but that's the kind of thing that a tensive symbol parable does. It creates a stir in your soul. It's a problem. It's disturbing, and it's meant to be disturbing. It's meant for you to linger on what is it that God is trying to say to me. So I'd like for us to just dive right in and think about this rather unique parable. And I want to tell you, by the way, that this parable comes between, it's right after Luke 15. It starts in chapter 16. So it's after the parables of the losts, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, the prodigal. And it comes before one that has to do with wealth, mammon, earthly resources, earthly riches, and the kingdom of God. And so it even brings up the intersection of which is it? Is it one about the losts, or is it one about mammon and our earthly resources and how to use it? Or is it both? So this is the way it begins. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man. So, by the way, the rich man is presumed to be a person who was an entrepreneur. Maybe he was a landowner. Maybe he was a person who traded in commodities based on what we're about to see. So there was a rich man who's what? Manager. Manager, so in the managing sense, this is more than an accountant. This is like his broker. This is the person who handles his business affairs for him, was accused of what? Wasting. So that word, Pastor Creighton let us know that prodigal actually means wasting. This could even say was accused of prodigaling his what? Possessions. The word in Greek is mammon. So it's earthly resources, riches. And so this manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he calls him in and he asks him, what is this that I hear about you? Give what? An account of your management, because you can no longer be manager. You can be my manager no longer. So essentially what he's saying is, all right, I'm going to see the books. But I also, want you to give me my books so that I've got them, you're done, based on what I'm hearing about you. Next slide. So the manager said to himself, what shall I do now? In other words, all of us have those crisis moments. All of us have those times that it's a moment of decision. All of us have that time when it's like, what am I going to do under the circumstances? And that's what he finds himself in. My master is taking away my job. I am not what? Strong enough to dig. All right, what's meant here is I can't be a laborer in the field. Because in those days, to be a laborer in the field, plowing was not sufficient for the sharp turns in these deep trenches. You had to dig by hand to be able to create the kind of trenches that were used out in the fields. And he's basically saying, I'm not up to that. I can't do that. And I'm what? Ashamed to beg. Now, we may think that that's an issue of pride, but actually what he's also saying is, I don't have the qualifications societally, culturally, to beg. I'm not blind. I'm not missing a limb. I don't have a permanent injury or a disability, so I can't beg and I can't work in the fields. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will what? Welcome me into their houses. All right, so I want to curry favor with these debtors. I want to be this magnanimous person who helps things get ironed out. Or as one Semitic source says, that can also be a Semitic approximation of basically saying, so I can land another job. Next slide. So he called in what? Each one of his master's. So he's doing this sort of respectfully and maybe in a more cunning way, but no listening ears. He's just talking to each debtor directly. He asks the first, how much do you owe my master? 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. And then the manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and what? Make it 450. So he cuts his indebtedness in half. In those 900 gallons of olive oil, the measurement back in the day was called a bath, and it was But the point is, that was about 3 years' salary for an average worker. So this is not a little bit of income. Now, it's hard to know whether or not he was simply erasing his own commission because he's in dire straits, or if he was actually reducing the usury, the wild interest rates, which would have, if he were Hebrew, and we suspect that he was in the story, that would have been against their code and their law. Usury wasn't allowed, and maybe that's why the rich man was upset with him, because he found out that he was charging these exorbitant rates. We don't really know, but what we know is that he reduced the bill, basically 3 years worth of pay for the average person, by half. Okay, so next slide. He asked the second, "How much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. So in other words, it's a plan. It's a way to bring that down. Now, this would represent, by the way, hundreds of acres of land for that wheat. This would represent the total amount, I should say. This would represent 7 years of average pay for a person. He reduces it by a fifth. So even though it's not half, as it was of the other person, where the total amount represented 3 years, here, by reducing it by a fifth, it's still a huge sum of money. The master what? Commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Now let's look at this for a minute. He lauds him. He commends him. He praises this manager because he had acted shrewdly. More about that, but inventively, creatively. He used his mind. He figured things out. For the people of this world, so even in the secular and in the non-religious, people of this world are more shrewd, more inventive, more creative in dealing with their own issues, own kind, than are the people of the light, the believers. Jesus is saying, I tell you, use. So leverage, facilitate. Use your worldly wealth to gain friends. It just seems like, is that just currying favor, or is there more to it for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be. So that's just a common sense kind of thing, right? If you can handle this much, then you can handle all the more. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? So now he's basically intoning something else. And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? Many people think that beyond the superficial aspect of it, of commending somebody for what seems to be unethical behavior, it's really about having a strategic plan, being quick on your feet, being nimble in your thinking, not just kind of twiddling your thumbs and, oh, I have good intentions, I'd really like to, what do I do about all this? But actually coming up with a plan that's doable, a plan that makes a difference. And it's sort of the whole adage, maybe you've heard it before, that those who fail to plan to fail. And it's sort of that way. Some feel like that's the major part of it. In fact, one great preacher said this parable has to do with what? Facing reality. The shrewd manager looked at the situation square in the face. In other words, he didn't dawdle, he didn't enter into wishful thinking, kind of thinking, well, maybe the old guy will give me a pass on this or something like that. And he didn't just have good intentions. He looked at the situation square in the face, realized, I've got a problem. And then he took responsibility. I brought this on myself. I have to be a part of the resolution. And then he came up with a doable plan, an actionable plan. I mean, it was results-oriented, the plan. It was going to produce some revenue for the rich man that he served. And then he took the action. Now, you know who this great preacher was? He goes by a peculiar name, Creighton K. Year 2012 is when that was part of what he said, was the thrust of it. And that's a very legitimate one, and others say the very same thing. In fact, going to that point, here's what was said by James Montgomery Boyce, who is a famous preacher, Presbyterian, evangelical. Sin traps people in indifference, so that they often become more what? Foolish about their self-preservation than the animals. We're people of impulse. We're people of living hand to mouth, not only physically, but sometimes we're that way spiritually. Geese and other birds will fly south as winter approaches. Rodents will store up for the winter. Some animals hibernate, but human beings proceed in a manner that they know is foolish and characteristically fail to make adequate provision for their future. We do this, again, physically, in our daily lives, practical things, but also spiritually. So here's a home. This is the only other time that Leanne and I owned a home in our entire lives, that we weren't in a parsonage. This is back in Green Bay when we first came to Wisconsin, having been out east where I was from. This house went for about $87,000. Yes, I am that old. We loved it, but we were house poor. First of all, we had to have a second mortgage. We were 100% financed. The church co-signed the second mortgage. I mean, we didn't have two nickels to rub together. And one of the things is we also were house poor in the sense that we didn't know how much houses cost to maintain, the repairs, stuff like that. Our kids were just little ones, elementary school for one and a toddler for the other. But we loved that house. But we had to immediately realize something. As poor as we were, or challenged as we were, I had pretty good life insurance. I got a lot of life insurance because I knew that if something happened to me, my wife would immediately lose her husband. She would lose, at that time in our lives, the main source of income. She would not be able to pay the rent, and she would lose the house. And that would be true even if we were in a parsonage later on. That it'd be like, hey, we're sorry about what's happened, but we need the place for somebody new who's coming in behind you. And then more often than not, she would, in a manner of speaking, lose her friends and her support network, because from a professional standpoint, when somebody new comes in as the pastor, you kind of need to let them have space to bond with folks and not be an interference. And so we knew that would happen. So we made sure that there would at least be enough life insurance that if something happened, we had a strategic plan, as Creighton said in his message, so that she'd be okay. She at least wouldn't have to overreact in the moment. Now, there was a time through our marriage, because we've ceased to need it in quite that way, where we also had some term insurance, right? So I'm just going to tell you, in my 40s, I was worth a lot of money if I was dead. So I did have a couple of those creepy days or nights when I woke up in the middle of the night, and here's Leanne with a pillow leaning over me. We got through that. There's another take on this story, what the intersection of superficial and deep, and it's this. The manager exercised his mind. He came up with a plan of action that, one, satisfies his master, so the person over him, he gets a return on the losses. It's not just going to be scrubbed. Secondly, he saves his job because the boss, the rich man, sees that he's inventive. He doesn't have to dig or beg, and he pleases who? The clients at a more manageable level of debt. So the common good is best for all. All rejoice. It's a win-win situation. Or as one person said, part of the breakthrough here of God is to stop thinking selfishly and to be a little bit more self-sacrificing so that all may win, so that it's a win-win situation. Next. The message of this parable, says John T. Squires, is letting go of possessions and wealth for the benefit of the common good. All right. But I think that this is the one that I side with, and it's all around that key word shrewd. For me, everything clips to and pins to this, both the straightforward as well as sort of there's more to it than that. And it's all around this word shrewd, that the dishonest manager acted shrewdly. And the word for shrewd in Greek, next slide, is this: phronimos. Now, here's what may surprise you. Phronimos is a morally ambiguous word. It's not negative and it's not positive. It just means being crafty, scheming, coming up with a plan. It means being creative. Now, negatively, it can be cunning. It can be deceitful. But being shrewd can also be a compliment, that somebody is imaginative. They are resourceful. They're not a dim light bulb, you know? And in fact, along that lines, it's all about thinking. Think, think, think. Do you remember this guy? I remember from my childhood. Think, think, think. To use your brain in an astute way, in a nimble way. Not being a rube, meaning sort of a country bumpkin for God, just shucksy, but actually being somebody who's sharp and, lets the Lord lead you in your thinking would be shrewd. To apply a keen and astute mind. So Douglas Weber says this about that. We see every day, all too often, how the world pursues its ends so devotedly because it has its interests at heart and spares no pain or effort to get them. On the other hand, we see how the children of light, that is, confessed Christians who are unproductive, listless, negligent, and indolent on divine matters, even though they know God delights in their efforts and they will enjoy his pleasure in eternity. Basically, what Webster is saying is that we give God our leftovers, and we ask God to bless that. We give God mediocrity, and we want God to be happy with that. So I remember when my wife's aunt was a missionary, a nurse missionary in Papua New Guinea many years ago. And while she was there, she received a package from somebody in the church, and when she opened it up, it was all kinds of used candles. Apparently, they were no longer of use to that person, but she thought on the mission field, maybe you can get some more use out of them. That's what I'm talking about when I say leftovers or mediocrity. Thinking somehow that honors God. Douglas Webster said this: Christ's kingdom strategy competes what? More effectively in the world than a worldly strategy. I mean, do you believe that? Do you believe that kingdom strategies are different from the earthly strategies? That kingdom strategies can rise to the level of excellence and really be shocking, really being stunning in terms of how useful they are. In fact, the scriptures tell us this. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 through 8, have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourselves in godliness. For the training of the body has limited benefit, nor the training in worldliness. But godliness is what? Beneficial in every way, since it holds promise for when? The present life, and also for the life to come. So that's what it's saying, is that, when we allow excellence to come out of the godliness that God's trying to instill in us, it has value, practically speaking, right in the here and now, but also in the life to come. This next one. So Jesus doesn't want his disciples to outwit the world with the shrewd manager strategies, duplicity and deception, but he does want us to outwit the world with truth and goodness. To have that kind of intensity, if you will. There's a guy by the name of David Redding who wrote a book called The Parables He Told. This goes all the way back to 1962. Tell me if this doesn't sound like we could learn from this. He says, watch the weather's tyranny on church attendance. It's worse on that than on baseball. House guests literally paralyze Christian production. Saturday night sabotages Sunday morning. This is the way the church will die, not with a fight, but with a sniffle. Think of the fervor spent in mastering the fine points of bridge or improving your golf game. It takes more coaching, more practice, better clubs. People spare nothing. Jesus is not damning that, but appropriating it for his cause. No man can get into heaven without equal dedication. It takes something more than a sleepy stab at it to master the more excellent way. It's not enough to be good. One must be inventive and indefatigable. He must be superior not only in motives but in zeal. So what is David Redding saying? He's saying, can we be in this world without being of this world and yet shine with a level of excellence, of godly excellence that this world needs? Can we do that? So I've told stories before about my dad, and I've characterized him as a hard-driving businessman. He, after all, is the person that when I said to him that I felt called to ministry, didn't flinch a bit, looked right at me and said, "Son, there's no money in it." But I went into it anyway. He had high hopes for this son or for me. And I remember when I was at a little student parish only 20 minutes from their house and just getting going in the ministry. And they would have a couple of big rummage sales a year and, get these secondhand clothing and sell it and try to raise money for the budget. And he was helping me sort it on a hot summer day. And we were going through these garbage bags full of clothing. And he came across some dirty underwear. And he looked at me like, "Son, what are you doing with your life? I had hoped you would do this or that, and you used to have aspirations of this." But what he found out is godliness got stirred up in me. So did I grow as a person. So did my character grow. So did my leadership grow. So did my skills grow. So did I grow in my willingness to do in the world for others. And suddenly, he became one of the biggest advocates. Before I went into ministry, he wasn't a churchgoer. When I went to college, I was afraid that's it. And when I was early in ministry, he won't go. He became all the more active than he had been before because godliness makes a difference. "I tell you," said Jesus. What does he say? "Use worldly wealth, unrighteous possessions, mammon, to what? Gain friends." Now this is perplexing. "For yourselves, so that when it's gone, you will be welcomed into what? Eternal dwellings." I think that this is the intersection of the earthly and the heavenly. And Jesus is saying what matters more than possessions are friends. Now we can make that just an earthly thing, but I think that Lloyd Ogilvie, the former Senate chaplain, nails it when he says this in his book, The Autobiography of God, God Revealed in the Parables of Jesus. He says, Jesus was not opposed to money, but he did know that it had the power to displace God in our lives. It's the first of the false gods. That's why he insisted that we use money to become friends with God and others, in service of others. Some questions demand answering. Has our spending brought us closer or further from God? Has our use of material resources accounted for the salvation or perhaps alleviation of suffering for any person in this past year? The Lord wants shrewdness in the earning and distribution of our money. Heaven should, this is the part I want you to hear about friends, heaven should be full of people who will cheer us when we enter. There should be hundreds who are there to cheer us, saying, "Welcome home. We're here because of you. You gave of yourself and your resources so that we could know the Savior, so that we could live eternally. Thanks for being you." And then you will remember Jesus saying, "And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of mammon of unrighteousness, that when it fails, they may receive you into their eternal dwellings." So again, here's a quote. I've already read the entirety from Lloyd Ogilvie, and I think it really makes the bridge. That when we're at the intersection of superficial, and there's more to it than that, we're also at the intersection of earthly and heavenly. And the thing that is the bridge that makes it all go together are these relationships where God uses us to touch another life for a kingdom end. I think Rick Warren nailed it the best. at a recent commencement when he said this.
What people say in their final moments is pretty important. They don't mess around. When people are dying in their last words, nobody has ever said, Pastor Rick, bring me my trophies. I want to look at them one more time. Or even bring me my college graduation certificate. I want to look at it one more time. When people are dying and they know their time is short, what they want in the room is not things or trophies or achievement. What they want are the people they love. Eventually, we all figure out that it's all about love. It's all about relationships. I just pray you'll figure it out a whole lot sooner.
Wow. So I want to invite you to something. Creighton, Karen, and Dave's excellent adventure. It's about us achieving excellence in godliness. But the reason I want to invite you to it is I don't think it's our adventure. I think it's the adventure that Jesus wants us to be on.